In today's video, we feature 3 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. None of these would have happened if it wasn't for underestimating nature, cockiness, and poor judgment. Each story, unfortunately, is worse than the last one. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On 5th September 2013, Brett Smith and his friend hadn't set out that day looking for anything more than a few hours of hunting in the rough backwoods of New Mexico. The landscape was desolate, vast stretches of dusty rock and occasional patches of forest. They'd heard the area was home to game, so they trudged through the rocky ground, rifles slung over their shoulders, with only basic supplies and a utility rope for emergencies. Neither of them was prepared for caving, nor did they have the right gear. Yet, they carried on, knowing the wilderness could be unpredictable. Then they spotted it, a jagged pit in the earth, nearly camouflaged by the rugged terrain. Brett walked closer, leaning over the edge. The hole looked innocent enough at first glance, with a wide opening tapering down sharply into a vertical shaft. It was roughly 35 feet deep and just dark enough to obscure the bottom. Locals called it Alcove Pit, or just the sinkhole, but it wasn't marked on any maps or signs. For seasoned cavers, it was a known hazard, an unpredictable spot notorious for its deceptive shape and sharp drops. They peered down into the blackness, feeling a spark of excitement at the unknown. Alcove Pit looked like something they could conquer, despite having no caving experience. An impulsive decision was made, one that Brett didn't think twice about. But Brett didn't see a hazard, he saw a challenge. Without proper gear or even a flashlight, he made the impulsive decision to go down and explore. His friend seemed uncertain, but Brett brushed off his concerns. He tied their nylon rope, a lightweight, multi-purpose cord they kept in case of emergencies, to a nearby tree. The rope wasn't made for climbing or rappelling, but they figured it would do the job just this once. As he started to lower himself, Brett felt a wave of excitement mixed with tension. The walls of the pit were closer than he'd anticipated, narrowing and pressing in as he descended. He braced his feet against the rock, slowly inching down, with his friend watching from above. The further down he went, the more his confidence wavered. The space grew tighter, forcing him to maneuver sideways, awkwardly twisting his body to avoid scraping against the jagged rock. He was sweating now, his arms tiring as he clung to the thin rope, feeling every pull of gravity as he edged deeper. Halfway down, Brett felt the pit change. The walls closed in sharply and he was forced to slide into a constricted space that barely allowed his shoulders through. His foot slipped, dislodging loose rocks that tumbled noisily to the bottom. The sound echoed up, stark and chilling. He was breathing harder, struggling to keep his grip on the rope. His arms burned with strain, his muscles giving way to exhaustion faster than he'd expected. Then came the moment of realization. He'd gone too far. Brett looked up and saw how far he'd come, and for the first time, he felt real fear. He tried to shout to his friend, telling him he was coming back up, but his voice sounded weak and shaky. His friend shouted back, telling him to hold on, but there was no clear plan. Brett's fingers were cramping, his muscles seizing from the strain. He could barely keep his hold. His breath came in gasps as he tried to pull himself up, but his arms shook with the effort, the weight of his own body too much to bear. Above, his friend was panicking, pacing back and forth as he tried to think of a way to help. Finally, he decided to use the ATV to pull Brett up, hoping the vehicle would give him the strength he lacked. He tied the rope to the ATV and started inching forward slowly, hoping the added tension would help Brett climb. But Brett felt the rope tighten in a way that wasn't right. He could feel the fibers stretching, straining, and weakening beneath him. He shouted for his friend to stop, but it was too late. A sudden snap filled the pit, and the rope gave way. In an instant, Brett was falling. He barely had time to react before his body was in free fall, the pit walls rushing past him. He fell nearly 20 feet, the impact jarring through his body as he slammed into the rocks below. Brett's body had hit the jagged rock below with a sickening thud, the force of the impact sending a shockwave through his bones. The agony was instant and overwhelming, and a groan escaped him as he tried to breathe, his chest tight and burning with every shallow gasp. Pain shot through his limbs, sharp and relentless, and he struggled to even shift his weight. For a moment, there was silence. His friend John stood frozen at the edge of the pit, staring into the blackness where Brett had fallen. His mind raced, still processing the snap of the rope, and the sickening thud that followed. Desperation gripped him, but he refused to give in to panic. He's alive, John thought, clinging to the hope that somehow, against all odds, Brett had survived the fall. He couldn't hear anything from the bottom, no sound of movement, no cries of pain. It was the cruelest kind of silence. To John, it felt like a Schrodinger's cat situation. Brett could be alive, or he could be gone. And John wouldn't know until he reached him. Time seemed to slow as he scrambled to call for help, his hands shaking as he dialed emergency services. They arrived quickly, the first responders working with methodical precision to begin the rescue. The team was hopeful, sure that Brett would be alive, that his cries were just muffled in the pit's deep recesses. The rescuers worked quickly, sending ropes down, shining bright flashlights into the black depths, calling Brett's name. But the pit offered no response, no movement, no sound. As they descended further, the tension thickened, hope beginning to fade into something more somber. When they finally reached the bottom, what they found was more brutal than anyone could have imagined. The team from the James Canyon Rope Rescue, the first to arrive, reached the bottom. There, Brett lay motionless, his body wedged between jagged rocks. The fall had been catastrophic. His injuries were severe, a cruel testament to the brutal impact. Despite any efforts to cling to life, it was clear that Brett had fought to stay conscious, to hold on, but ultimately he had succumbed to the merciless force of the fall. The lifelessness of his body was a grim confirmation. His struggle had ended long before they had arrived. John stood above the pit, eyes locked on the rope, now slack as the reality of what had happened hit him. He had hoped for a miracle, but now, in the silence that filled the pit, the horrifying discovery was undeniable. Brett had not made it. The task of bringing him back to the surface began. Using ropes and pulleys, they lifted his body, ensuring not to disturb the fragile balance that held him wedged in the crevice. After what felt like an eternity, Brett was carefully hoisted to the surface, his body draped over the edge of the pit, where the rescuers stood in silence, knowing the effort had come far too late. By the time they emerged, hours had passed. The pit was silent once more, an empty scar in the earth, a reminder of the risk and tragedy that came from underestimating its depths. This next story follows two kids whose cockiness resulted them to ignore all rules and ultimately getting into serious danger. Driven by a mix of thrill-seeking and defiance, they dismissed every warning, convinced that nothing could go wrong. On July 18, 1980, David Carson and John Brock, both 19, arrived at Carlsbad Caverns National Park, New Mexico. They were thrill-seekers, driven by a desire to explore places few dared to venture. That afternoon, they had stopped at a nearby bar, fueling their excitement with a few drinks before heading to the park. By the time they arrived at the visitor center, closing time was approaching, and most visitors were wrapping up their day. But Carson and Brock had other plans. They were looking for more than a simple tour. Their goal was to push past the regular trails and see what lay beyond the official boundaries, drawn to the dark, unmapped passages of the caverns. As they reached the main entryway, they saw the last groups of tourists being ushered out. Undeterred by the setting sun and the closing hours, the two stepped onto the main tour path and made their way deeper into the cave. They reached the wide open chamber known as the Eve Theater. Here, a large chain blocked further access, with a prominent sign warning, "Do not go beyond chain." For most visitors, this would be the end of the line, a clear signal to turn back. But the warning only enticed Carson and Brock, whose judgment was clouded by alcohol and their hunger for adventure. With a quick glance around to ensure they were alone, they stepped over the chain, crossing from the well-lit trails into the shadows beyond. As they continued along the trail, they were enveloped by the silence and vastness of the underground. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the air had a sense of terror to it. Carson led the way with his flashlight, which lit barely enough to show them the way in the pitch-black darkness. It was here, in the deep silence of the cave, that they both felt the horrors of the unknown, a world untouched by most humans. The cave silence seemed to be their constant companion, broken only by the soft crunch of their footsteps. They moved carefully, aware of the dangers, or, as so they thought, since they were under the influence of alcohol after all. Few feet ahead, they spotted a locked gate, installed to keep visitors from venturing into the more treacherous areas of the cave. They paused, considering their options. For many, The gate would have been the end of the journey, but for Carson and Brock, ignored the warnings yet again and were quite determined to keep going. They searched for a way around the gate. Soon they spotted a narrow ledge above the main path, where they could attempt to bypass the barrier. The ledge was precarious, slick with guano and uneven in places. Carson took the lead, carefully navigating the narrow path with his flashlight in one hand, finding his footing on the edge as he pulled himself up. Brock followed close behind, each step feeling more dangerous than the last. Below them, the ground dropped away into darkness. Every step was a risk, each foothold a small victory. Yet, they continued, convinced they would soon reach an area of the cave few had ever seen. Around 9:45 p.m., as Carson moved along the ledge, his foot suddenly slipped on a loose patch of rock. His balance wavered, and in a split second, he lost his footing entirely. The drop was unforgiving. He plummeted 40 feet, landing on a rubble pile below. The impact reverberated through the silence. The impact was loud and clear that made Brock froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Below, Carson lay still, surrounded by jagged rocks and debris. The silence turned into painful cries and a terrible nightmare for both of them. Brock scrambled down to reach him, his mind racing as he checked for any signs of life. When Brock reached him, Carson was barely conscious, his face twisted in agony and full with tears. He was pinned under a heavy layer of rubble, trapped in a small pocket of air as jagged rocks pressed down on him from all sides. Brock quickly removed the pieces of heavy rock on top of his friend. Carson's body was battered, cuts and bruises covering his arms, face, and torso. But what really made Brock's heart sink was the way Carson's legs lay twisted and motionless. Brock carefully tried to lift Carson's upper body, only to hear a sharp scream tear from his friend's throat. His face was pale, his eyes glazed over with a haunting look of fear and regret, as if he could already sense the gravity of his injuries. Carson, in immense pain and agony, told Brock that he can't feel his legs. The words hung heavy in the damp air, filling Brock with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. He knew what it meant, but couldn't bring himself to say it aloud. Panic clawed at Brock's mind. They were deep in the cave, cut off from the main path, in a place where no one would hear a scream for help. With every second that passed, Carson's breathing turned into short gasps, his skin turning paler by the minute. Brock's mind raced. He knew he had to find help, but leaving Carson alone in this condition felt like an impossible choice. He reached for Carson's hand, squeezing it tightly as he fought the wave of terror building inside him. With Carson paralyzed and trapped in the rubble, Brock's immediate action was necessary to secure his friend's safety. Leaving Carson behind, he began the arduous task of navigating back through the passages of Carlsbad Caverns, his mind racing with fear and responsibility. The thought of his decision to venture into the forbidden areas under the influence was putting him in guilt. He deemed himself responsible for his friend's life or death situation, blaming himself for their reckless actions. As Brock pressed on, his panic intensified, causing him to lose his bearings within the complex network of passages. Disoriented and overwhelmed by self-doubt, he wandered aimlessly, the fear of losing his way compounding his desperation. He got lost and couldn't find his way out. Memories of Carson's paralyzed lower body in his mind, and the potential consequences of their actions clouded his judgment, making it increasingly difficult to focus. In a moment of sheer determination, Brock slapped himself sharply across the face, a desperate attempt to regain his concentration and clarity. Slowly, he began to retrace his steps. Brock navigated the terrain, his resolve strengthening with each successful step. Hours of relentless effort paid off, as he finally emerged from the depths of the cavern, breathless and exhausted. He returned to the visitor center, where he found Park Ranger John McLaughlin and informed him of the accident. McLaughlin immediately called for a technical rescue team, knowing that time was critical. Within the hour, a team of experienced rescuers equipped with ropes, stretchers, and stabilizing gear arrived at the site. They quickly assessed the situation and prepared for the extraction. Carson's injuries were severe, and any movement could worsen his condition. Stabilizing him was their first priority, so they carefully strapped him onto a backboard, securing his spine as best as possible to prevent any additional damage. The rescue operation was delicate and methodical, with each step taken slowly to minimize pain and risk. As the team began the long ascent back through the narrow passageways, they faced numerous challenges. The path was steep and uneven, with sharp turns and slippery surfaces that made carrying a stretcher extremely difficult. The rescuers coordinated their movements carefully, communicating in low voices as they navigated each section of the cave. Hours passed as they slowly made their way back to the surface. Finally, as dawn broke over the desert, the rescue team emerged from the cave entrance, exhausted but relieved to have brought Carson out safely. He was immediately transported to the Guadalupe Medical Center, where doctors confirmed the extent of his injuries. Carson had suffered a severe spinal injury, leaving him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The news hit hard, not only for Carson and his family, but also for the park and the caving community. Carson and Brock's actions had been reckless, fueled by alcohol and disregard for safety guidelines. This incident reinforced the importance of respecting cave environments and adhering to safety protocols. In the aftermath, park officials implemented stricter measures, including reinforced barriers and increased patrols near restricted areas, to prevent similar incidents. This last story is heartbreaking, taking place deep beneath the tiny, twisting corridors of a lesser-known cave, hidden away in a lonely location. Benjamin Miller and two of his buddies had gone out to explore this unknown cave, motivated by curiosity and the thrill of adventure. The cave was infamous among the few who knew about it, with tight, strangely slanted corridors that seemed to wrap around themselves, forming a maze of stones. As they moved farther into the cave, squeezing through narrow gaps and crawling on their bellies, they came across a particularly tight corridor. The air was thin, and the cold of the stone walls appeared to soak into their bones. The light from their headlamps danced across the jagged rocks, forming strange shadows. While leading the group, Benjamin observed what appeared to be an opening ahead, which would lead to a larger distance. He decided to go since he was excited by the idea of reaching a larger chamber. He announced to his friends that he believes there is a larger space ahead. He started to squeeze through the little aperture without waiting for a second opinion. However, as he pushed himself deeper down the channel, it began to narrow dramatically, twisting abruptly in an unforgiving angle. Before he knew it, he was stuck. Panic set in as he attempted to pull himself back, but the rock gripped him strongly, pressing against his chest and back. The cold, unyielding stone acted like a vice around him. His companions rushed to his side, squeezing through the narrow passage to reach him. They could see the fear in Ben's eyes, and his breath came in thin gasps as he strained to move. Every attempt to release him only appeared to strengthen the stone's grip. They tried pulling and pushing, but nothing worked. Ben's body was twisted in an unusual position, trapped snugly against the bend of the tube. They recognized the gravity of the issue and understood they needed assistance. One of them managed to wriggle back through the tube into the surface, where he desperately called for rescuers. As they waited in the chilly, dark cave, the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. Ben's breathing became difficult, and his face was covered in sweat. Upon their arrival, the rescue crew promptly evaluated the situation. They were aware that the operation would be difficult. They had to chisel the rock and install a pulley system because the cave was too small to utilize heavy equipment, but it didn't seem to make much of a difference. Ben's condition deteriorated over the course of the hours. His body was crushed and twisted in ways that no human being should have to go through, and the pain was unbearable. He found it difficult to breathe because of the passage's oppressive tightness pressing against his chest. The rescue crew had to force fresh air down the channel because the cave's poor air quality only made the suffocating worse. Still, he was having trouble. The coolness of the cave started to worsen the situation. Ben began to shiver violently as his body temperature fell dangerously low. Heating pads were applied to him by the rescuers in an attempt to prevent hypothermia, although they were only effective to a certain extent in the freezing conditions. The situation became more desperate as the hours passed. His face showed how much anguish he was in. His vitality was ebbing away as the cold and darkness appeared to enclose him. The small route was unforgiving, despite the rescuers' best efforts to chip away at the rock and modify the pulley system. Ben's body was exhausted, and he could no longer cooperate with the rescue team. His strength had entirely drained away. The suffocation, anguish, and cold were too much to take. As the rescuers were able to widen the gap enough to liberate him, they realized he couldn't move on his own due to the toll, so they hurried him to the hospital. Unfortunately, he passed away.